You think Genghis Khan was just another medieval warlord who conquered a lot of land? But what if I told you he created a state-run sexual economy that operated like a modern corporation, complete with scoring systems, inventory management, and quality control? We're talking about a 7,000-woman census where human beings were literally graded on a 100-point scale. This narrative draws from medieval chronicles and modern genetic findings to reveal the truth. Today, we're uncovering how conquest became systematic exploitation. This isn't just about one man's cruelty, this is about how trauma became state policy. By the time he counted his women, he'd built entire bureaus to run them. But it all started with something much more personal than anyone realizes. That personal story begins with a woman whose name most people have never heard. Most people think empires start with ambition or greed, but what if I told you the Mongol Empire began with a kidnapping? Picture this, it's 1184, and a young woman named Borte is living what passes for a peaceful life on the Mongolian steppes. She's recently married to an 18-year-old named Temujin, a minor tribal leader's son who's trying to make his way in a world where survival depends on cattle, horses, and knowing which way the wind blows. Their felt tent sits quietly under stars that have watched over countless generations of nomads. Borte is weaving, maybe preparing for the harsh winter ahead, completely unaware that her life is about to become the catalyst for something monstrous. The attack comes in the dead of night. 3 Merkit warriors crash through the darkness like demons, their horses' hooves thundering against the frozen ground. These aren't random raiders looking for cattle or silver. They're here for revenge against Temujin's father, who had once stolen a Merkit woman years earlier. The old debt is now being collected in blood and flesh. Borte screams as rough hands drag her from her bed, her fingers clawing at the tent walls, at her husband's arms, at anything that might anchor her to safety. But Temujin doesn't fight. He runs. Imagine young Temujin crouched in the forest, his heart hammering against his ribs as his wife's screams echo through the trees. He listens to those cries grow fainter until they disappear completely into the black night. When he finally emerges at dawn, the camp is destroyed. The horses are gone. Borte is gone. Here's what most people don't understand about Mongol culture in the 12th century. In 12th century Mongol society, a woman's capture carried social stigma that damaged a husband's public honor. Even if rescued, even if recovered alive and unharmed, the shame followed her like a shadow. The community would whisper. Her own children might question their parentage. This wasn't about romance or modern ideas of marriage. This was about masculine identity, tribal standing, and social survival in a world where reputation meant everything. Temujin spends the next 8 months as a man possessed. He rides from camp to camp, calling in favors, making promises, building alliances with anyone who will listen. His desperation becomes legendary among the scattered tribes. Some warriors join him out of sympathy. Others see opportunity in his growing network of allies. He learns the art of persuasion during these months, discovering that shared enemies create powerful bonds. Every night he stares into the fire and imagines what Borte is enduring. Medieval records report that the rescue, when it finally comes, plays out like something from a war epic. Temujin leads a coalition of warriors against the Merkit camp in a dawn raid that leaves dozens dead. He finds Borte alive. And for a moment, you might think this is where the story ends happily. But this isn't a fairy tale. The damage runs deeper than physical wounds. Borte returns to him pregnant, carrying a child whose father could be either Temujin or her Merkit captor. The boy, named Jochi, meaning guest, will grow up under a cloud of suspicion that will haunt him his entire life. But the truly disturbing part isn't what happened to Borte or even to Jochi. It's what happened to Temujin's mind during those 8 months of searching. Something fundamental broke inside him, something that would never heal properly. He had learned that in this world, the men with power take what they want from those without it. He had discovered that shame and helplessness taste the same, whether you're the victim or the one who failed to prevent the crime. Most importantly, he had realized that the only way to ensure this never happened again was to become the one doing the taking. The young man who rescued his wife from the Merkits was still recognizably human. The man who returned to his tent that night had already begun his transformation into something else entirely. Borke's kidnapping didn't just wound Temujin's pride. It gave him a blueprint for weaponizing sexual violence on a scale that would make the Merkits look like amateurs. What started as one woman's nightmare was about to become the template for an empire built on systematic terror. The transformation from victim to architect of terror reveals how personal trauma can reshape entire civilizations. Here's what most people don't realize about trauma. Sometimes it doesn't make you weaker, it makes you monstrous. Temujin couldn't fix what had happened to Borte. Every time he looked at her, he saw his own failure reflected back. Every time other tribal leaders gathered, he felt their unspoken judgment hanging in the air like smoke. The whispers followed him wherever he went. Some people pointed at Jochi and wondered aloud whose blood really ran through the boy's veins. Others questioned whether a man who couldn't protect his own wife deserved to lead anyone else's sons into battle. The shame ate away at Temujin like acid. In Mongol society, a leader's strength came from his ability to protect his people and his honor. Both had been stripped from him in a single night. Modern scholars argue that this psychological wound drove his later systematic approach to sexual violence, though we must interpret his behavior through medieval sources that reveal patterns rather than explicit motivations. He couldn't undo Borte's captivity or erase the months she spent in enemy hands, but he could make sure that what happened to him never happened to anyone else. More importantly, he could make sure it happened to everyone who opposed him. The psychological shift manifested first in his campaigns against the Merkits themselves. Temujin began viewing sexual violence not as a random cruelty of war, but as the ultimate weapon of control. Think about it from his twisted perspective. Physical pain heals. Economic losses can be recovered. Even military defeats can be overcome with time and patience. But sexual shame? That burrows deep into a culture's bones and stays there. It destroys families from within. It makes people question their own worth, their bloodlines, their future. Medieval accounts describe how Temujin's forces systematically targeted Merkit women during his revenge campaigns, establishing the collective reprisal and sexual policies that would later define empire-wide practices. When his forces captured enemy camps, the killings stopped being random. Women and children were separated with surgical precision. The elderly were eliminated quickly, but women of childbearing age were preserved like valuable livestock. Young girls were evaluated and cataloged. The prettiest ones were reserved for his growing inner circle of loyal warriors. These weren't acts of passion or battlefield chaos. Temujin was developing a system. He watched how enemy tribes reacted when their women were taken. He studied the psychological impact on fathers who had to live with the knowledge that their daughters were being distributed among Mongol warriors like spoils of war. He noticed how quickly resistance crumbled when communities realized that fighting back meant watching their women suffer while they remained powerless to stop it. The twisted logic becomes clear when you understand his mindset. If he couldn't erase his own shame, he would make sure his enemies felt infinitely worse. Every woman his forces captured represented a small victory against the helplessness he had experienced during those 8 months of searching for Borte. Every pregnancy among captives was proof of his power to reshape bloodlines and destroy cultural continuity. Every child born from these unions carried Mongol DNA into enemy populations, slowly erasing their genetic heritage from the inside out. What started as individual acts of revenge evolved into calculated policies of conquest. Temujin began issuing specific orders about how conquered populations should be handled. Women were to be evaluated based on age, beauty, and skills. The most attractive were sent to designated collection points. Pregnant women were monitored to ensure healthy births. Children born from these unions were tracked and given preferential treatment within Mongol society. Sexual violence had become state policy. By the time Temujin united the Mongol tribes under his rule, sexual terror had become the empire's signature weapon. The wounded husband had become the architect of systematic terror. Borte's abduction had taught him that the most effective way to break an enemy wasn't to kill their warriors or burn their cities. It was to take their women, plant Mongol children in their wombs, and force them to raise the next generation of conquerors. But turning revenge into policy required organization, and that's where the Mongol system gets chillingly modern. What emerged was an assembly line for human suffering that would make modern corporations envious. By 1206, when Temujin officially became Genghis Khan, he had transformed random acts of wartime violence into systematic processing that turned conquest into a science. This wasn't soldiers getting carried away in the heat of battle. This was precision, efficiency, and quality control applied to human misery. Picture the scene after a Mongol victory. Conquered cities that once bustled with merchants and families now looked like outdoor factories. Thousands of captives stood in designated areas, organized by gender and age, while Mongol officials moved between them with the same methodical approach you'd see at a livestock market. The chaos of warfare had given way to something far more chilling. Bureaucratic efficiency applied to human trafficking on an industrial scale. The process started with what they called population sorting. Every person in a conquered settlement was evaluated and categorized within hours of capture. Children under 10 were separated immediately. Men over 40 were typically executed on the spot to eliminate potential resistance leaders and reduce feeding costs. Boys between 10 and 16 were assessed for military potential or craft skills. But it was the evaluation of women and girls that revealed the true horror of this machine. Age verification came first. Officials used teeth examination and physical development markers to determine exact ages, because different age groups served different purposes in the Mongol system. Girls under 12 were designated for future use and given basic care until they reached maturity. Women between 13 and 35 underwent the most thorough evaluations, since they represented the highest value in terms of both immediate use and reproductive potential. Then came the virginity checks and beauty assessments, conducted in full view of families and communities to maximize psychological impact and terrorize the population. These weren't private medical examinations conducted with any pretense of dignity. Parents watched helplessly as their daughters were subjected to invasive procedures and evaluations. Officials examined teeth for signs of health, checked hands for evidence of manual labor, and evaluated overall physical condition using standardized protocols that reduced women to numerical scores. The psychological warfare aspect was deliberate and calculated. Fathers were forced to watch their daughters being examined like merchandise. Mothers had to stand silently while officials discussed their children's physical attributes in clinical terms. Brothers watched sisters being graded and sorted based on their potential value to Mongol commanders. The message was clear. Resistance had consequences that extended far beyond death. Officials moved through crowds with wooden tablets, recording every detail about each woman and girl. They noted ethnicity, estimated age, physical characteristics, any special skills like weaving or languages, and family connections that might prove useful. These weren't rough notes scribbled in the heat of a moment. These were detailed records that would follow these women throughout their captivity, updating their status as circumstances changed. Here's the truly disturbing part. The Mongols that created a 100-point scoring system for categorizing and distributing captured women. The breakdown was ruthlessly simple. Beauty, fertility, skills, and status. Physical appearance and age accounted for the majority of points, heavily weighted toward women in their peak reproductive years. Skills like languages, crafts, and literacy increased a woman's value, while social status and family connections provided strategic advantages. Such a system required officials, records, and quotas, not chaos. The cold precision extended to the distribution process. Women weren't randomly assigned to soldiers based on luck or personal preference. Scores above 90 meant direct assignment to the Khan's personal collection or to his most trusted generals. Women scoring between 70 and 89 were distributed among regular military commanders. Those with scores between 50 and 69 went to ordinary soldiers and administrative personnel. Anyone scoring below 50 was typically assigned to support roles or sent to comfort stations along the empire's expanding trade routes. This scoring system became the empire's standard procedure, applied consistently across all conquered territories from China to Eastern Europe. But managing thousands of women across a growing empire created logistical challenges that would test even the most organized military machine. The solution required unprecedented bureaucratic precision. By 1215, Genghis Khan faced a logistical nightmare that would challenge even modern corporations. His personal collection had grown to nearly 7,000 women distributed across mobile camps that moved with the army, seasonal residences scattered across conquered territories, and permanent facilities in major administrative centers. These weren't just numbers on a page. Each woman represented a living, breathing human being who needed food, shelter, medical care, and constant supervision. The Khan had essentially created the world's largest human trafficking operation, and it required the same administrative precision that other empires used to manage their armies. The existence of official records documenting every woman in the Khan's personal collection reveals the chilling bureaucratic nature of this system. Mongol clerks maintained detailed ledgers that tracked each woman's location, physical condition, pregnancy status, and assigned duties. Some of these standardized records survive in Chinese archives, providing disturbing evidence of the system's scope. These weren't rough notes scribbled by soldiers. These were professional administrative documents that followed consistent formats across the entire empire. Each entry included the woman's original name, her assigned Mongol designation, her ethnic background, age at capture, physical description, and current assignment within the Khan's household structure. The constant movement required by nomadic military campaigns created tracking nightmares that required a communication network rivaling the empire's military intelligence system. The Khan's collection wasn't housed in a single location like a traditional palace. Keeping track of who was where at any given time demanded precise coordination between dozens of separate facilities spread across thousands of miles of conquered territory. Women were classified by ethnicity, age, skills, and status, exactly like inventory in a modern warehouse. Chinese women were grouped separately from Persian captives, who were kept distinct from European prisoners. Within each ethnic category, women were subdivided by age groups that corresponded to their assigned roles. The youngest served as attendants and trainees. Women in their prime reproductive years were designated for the Khan's personal use or for breeding programs designed to produce mixed-race children who would serve as cultural bridges in conquered territories. Older women with specific skills became supervisors, teachers, or craft specialists within the household system. The ranking system that sent women scoring above 90 directly to the Khan himself created its own administrative challenges. These highest-rated captives required special transportation, enhanced security, and luxury accommodations that matched their elevated status within the collection. They lived in silk-lined tents with personal servants, but this privileged treatment came with increased surveillance and stricter rules about contact with the outside world. The mobile palace complexes that traveled with the army were essentially harems on wheels, with their own staff and guards. These weren't simple tents that could be packed quickly for military movements. These were elaborate structures that required dozens of workers to assemble and dismantle. Each complex included sleeping quarters for different ranks of women, administrative offices for record-keeping, kitchens capable of feeding hundreds of people, medical facilities staffed by captured physicians, and workshops where women produced textiles and crafts for the Khan's household. Picture armies of clerks maintaining detailed records of pregnancies, births, and deaths across this vast network of human property. Pregnancy tracking became essential for planning future resource allocation and determining inheritance rights for mixed-race children. Birth records documented paternity when possible, assigned Mongol names to newborns, and determined their future roles within the empire's social hierarchy. Death records tracked casualties from disease, childbirth complications, and other causes that affected the overall value and productivity of the Khan's collection. The record-keeping extended to behavioral assessments and skill evaluations that determined each woman's long-term placement within the system. Clerks noted language abilities that might prove useful for diplomatic purposes. They documented craft skills that could contribute to the household economy. They tracked signs of resistance or cooperation that influenced security arrangements and privilege levels. Medical care required its own bureaucratic structure, complete with captured physicians, midwives, and herbalists who maintained health records for the entire collection. Maintaining this system required resources comparable to supporting cavalry divisions, consuming significant portions of the empire's administrative capacity and treasury. Genghis Khan managed his personal collection of 7,000 women through bureaucratic precision that rivaled any modern organization. But this massive personal system represented just the beginning of an empire-wide infrastructure of sexual exploitation that would span continents. To keep this machine running, the Mongols repurposed the empire's fastest logistics network. The Yam postal network provided the perfect infrastructure for continental-scale exploitation. Every great empire needs roads, but what if those roads were designed to transport human misery? The Mongol Empire's success depended on the Yam postal network, a communication system that connected territories from Korea to Hungary through a chain of relay stations. Historians praise this network as one of the most advanced logistics systems of the medieval world. Merchants used it to transport goods. Diplomats relied on it for official correspondence. Military commanders coordinated campaigns through its lightning-fast message delivery. But the yam provided horses, supplies, and comfort houses staffed with captive women, all integrated into official station architecture. This innocent-sounding courier system had a third function that most people never learn about in school. Every major yam station included what officials called comfort houses alongside the stables and administrative buildings. These weren't small additions to existing facilities. These were substantial structures with dormitories that could house dozens of women, administrative offices for record-keeping, and medical facilities for managing the health of captives. Picture a typical station. Horse paddocks and grain storage on one side, administrative quarters in the center, and a cordoned area surrounded by higher walls where the comfort houses operated under constant guard. Station masters maintained detailed inventories that tracked every woman assigned to their location, just like they tracked horses and supplies. These records included physical descriptions, ethnic backgrounds, ages, special skills, and behavioral assessments that determined security requirements. Women who showed signs of resistance faced isolation and increased supervision. Those who cooperated received better accommodations and limited freedoms within the station compound. Pregnant women were monitored with special attention to ensure successful deliveries that would increase the station's human inventory. Women were moved regularly between stations to prevent escape and erase local ties. A woman captured in Khwarezmia might spend her first months at a station near the Caspian Sea, then be transferred to facilities in Central Asia, and eventually end up serving at stations along the trade routes to China. This constant movement made escape nearly impossible and ensured that women never developed enough local knowledge to plan successful breakouts or form resistance networks with other captives. The bureaucratic normalcy was chilling in its efficiency. Station masters kept inventories and met quotas for their human cargo, while imperial inspectors conducted regular audits to ensure proper management. Documentation requirements created their own administrative burden. Station masters tracked pregnancies with the same precision they applied to horse breeding programs. They recorded birth dates, paternity when known, and survival rates for children born within the system. Death records documented causes of mortality and included recommendations for preventing similar losses at other stations. Supply chains kept this continental network operational through dedicated resource allocation systems. Food requirements alone demanded careful planning, since each station needed to feed not only staff and travelers, but also dozens of captive women and their children. Medical supplies included herbs and treatments for pregnancy-related complications, diseases common in overcrowded facilities, and injuries resulting from violence or escape attempts. Guard rotations ensured adequate security while preventing individual guards from developing sympathetic relationships with captives. The network's efficiency made sexual exploitation as routine as changing horses. Travelers with proper credentials could request accommodations that included access to the comfort houses. Military units passing through stations received similar services as part of their official support package. Diplomatic missions were provided with entertainment that included women selected based on the visitor's ethnic preferences and social status. This wasn't considered unusual or controversial within Mongol society. It was simply another service provided by the imperial infrastructure. Transportation logistics moved women between stations using the same routes and schedules that carried official mail and military supplies.
Covered wagons designed for transporting captives included security features like reinforced locks and small windows that prevented escape while allowing for basic ventilation. Guards assigned to these transport duties received specific training in managing resistant prisoners and preventing coordinated escape attempts during the vulnerable transfer periods. Behind every administrative detail lay a human being whose life had been reduced to inventory numbers and transfer orders. The machinery of systematic sexual exploitation had become so thoroughly integrated into imperial administration that it functioned like any other government service. Regional administrators submitted quarterly reports that included statistics on the comfort houses alongside data about message delivery times and horse maintenance costs. But this infrastructure was just the delivery system for something far more sinister. The Mongols had discovered that conquest didn't require killing everyone when you could simply replace them. The biological replacement strategy became their most devastating innovation. What if I told you the Mongols invented a form of warfare that could erase your people from history without killing everyone? Most military strategies focus on defeating armies or capturing territory. But Genghis Khan developed something far more insidious. He discovered that you could eliminate entire ethnic groups without massive bloodshed through calculated reproduction. This was a repeated pattern in multiple campaigns, especially against groups like the Tatars, a nomadic people who had been enemies of Temujin's family for generations. The Mongols didn't just want to defeat the Tatars. They wanted to make sure Tatars ceased to exist as a distinct people. This wasn't about land or resources or traditional military objectives. This was about ethnic extinction through biological manipulation. The strategy required cold mathematical precision that treated human reproduction like livestock breeding. Every pregnancy became a strategic weapon. Every child born represented progress toward the complete absorption of Tatar genetic lines into Mongol bloodlines. The systematic approach wasn't random violence driven by battlefield chaos. This was calculated ethnic destruction disguised as conquest. Mongol commanders received specific orders about how to handle Tatar populations once military resistance ended. The instructions were precise and horrifying in their clarity. Mongol orders reportedly measured males against a set height to determine execution or assimilation. The height measurement corresponded roughly to the age when boys could begin military training or pose future threats to Mongol control. Picture Mongol soldiers moving through conquered Tatar settlements with measuring sticks, literally determining life and death based on how tall someone stood next to a wagon axle. Boys who had grown tall enough to reach the measurement were separated from their families and killed on the spot. Younger boys were distributed among Mongol families for adoption and cultural conversion. But it was the treatment of Tatar women that revealed the true scope of this biological warfare campaign. Tatar women weren't killed or enslaved in the traditional sense. They were systematically distributed among Mongol troops according to carefully planned allocation systems. Young women went to regular soldiers. Older women with specific skills were assigned to administrative personnel. The most attractive women were reserved for commanders and the Khan's inner circle. But every assignment served the same strategic purpose, ensuring that future Tatar children would carry Mongol paternal DNA. Pregnancy monitoring became as systematic as the horse breeding programs that defined Mongol military success. Captured women were watched for signs of conception and received enhanced care to ensure successful deliveries that would advance the genetic replacement strategy. The long-term vision extended far beyond immediate military victory. Mongol planners understood that Tatar ethnicity could be systematically erased over just 2 or 3 generations if they controlled reproduction carefully enough. Children born from these forced unions would be raised as Mongols, speak Mongol languages, and follow Mongol customs. Their own children would have even less connection to Tatar heritage. Within a century, genetic traces of Tatar bloodlines would exist only within Mongol family structures.
Bureaucratic tracking systems ensured that Mongol genetic lineage dominated conquered territories through meticulous record-keeping. Clerks documented every pregnancy among former Tatar women. They recorded birth dates, paternity, and survival rates with clinical precision. Children received Mongol names and were integrated into Mongol social structures from birth. Many grew up completely unaware of their Tatar maternal ancestry. Administrative oversight extended to marriage arrangements for mixed-race children as they reached maturity. Mongol authorities carefully planned unions that would further dilute remaining Tatar genetic markers while strengthening connections to Mongol bloodlines. Women with partial Tatar ancestry were often married to full Mongol men. Men with Tatar mothers were encouraged to take multiple wives from purely Mongol backgrounds. Each generation saw systematic reduction in Tatar genetic influence within the population. The absorption process happened so thoroughly that entire ethnic groups simply disappeared from historical records. Villages that had been Tatar for centuries became Mongol settlements within a single generation. Languages that had survived for millennia vanished as children learned only Mongol dialects. Cultural practices, religious traditions, and social customs that had defined Tatar identity for generations were replaced by Mongol alternatives. And modern genetics shows the long-term effect of this policy across vast regions of Asia. But implementing this strategy required more than administrative precision. It demanded public demonstrations so terrifying that resistance would crumble before it could even begin. The Oyat crisis of 1223–1224 became the blueprint for psychological warfare that would terrorize an entire continent. Sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a sword or arrow. It's making an example so horrifying that entire nations surrender without fighting. By 1223, the Mongol Empire had perfected this psychological warfare to a degree that would make modern propagandists envious. What happened to the Oyat people wasn't just conquest. It was calculated terrorism, designed to send a message that would echo across every tribe, kingdom, and settlement from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe. The Oyat were a relatively small nomadic people who controlled strategic grazing lands along important trade routes in Central Asia. Their territory wasn't particularly valuable in terms of gold or silk, but it sat at a crossroads that the Mongols needed for their expanding empire. When Mongol envoys arrived demanding submission, the Oyat leaders made a fatal miscalculation. They had heard stories about Mongol brutality, but they believed their geographic isolation and limited strategic value might spare them from the worst excesses. They were wrong on both counts. The Oyats' refusal to submit triggered a response that went far beyond normal military retaliation. Genghis Khan decided to use their resistance as an opportunity to demonstrate exactly what happened to people who defy Mongol authority. This wasn't going to be a quick military campaign followed by the usual terms of surrender. This was going to be a demonstration of absolute power designed to terrify every potential enemy within 1,000 miles. Mongol forces surrounded Oyat settlements in a coordinated operation that prevented escape while maximizing the psychological impact of what followed. Instead of the rapid strikes that characterized most Mongol campaigns, this attack unfolded with deliberate slowness. Families were separated methodically. Men were killed in full view of their wives and children. But it was the treatment of Oyat women and girls that revealed the true purpose of this campaign. Picture this scene. Thousands of very young girls and adolescents gathered in a massive public square while their families watched from behind Mongol guards. These weren't random captives swept up in battlefield chaos. These were carefully selected females, chosen specifically for their youth and reproductive potential. They stood in organized groups based on age and physical characteristics, already sorted according to the Mongol distribution system that had become standard across the empire. The calculated cruelty of forcing parents to witness their daughters' systematic distribution among Mongol units served multiple purposes. It demonstrated absolute Mongol control over the conquered population. It guaranteed that survivors would carry traumatic memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. It created living witnesses who would spread the story to other communities considering resistance. Every parent forced to watch their daughter being assigned to a Mongol warrior became an unwilling ambassador of terror. This wasn't random violence driven by soldiers losing control after battle. This was carefully orchestrated psychological warfare, conducted with the same precision the Mongols applied to their military campaigns. Officers moved through the crowds with written assignments, matching specific girls to specific units based on predetermined criteria. The process took hours, with deliberate pauses designed to maximize the psychological torture of watching families. The Mongols took this psychological warfare one step further by forcing surviving Ayat men to participate in the distribution process. Fathers had to confirm which girls belonged to their families and provide information about their daughters' ages and skills. This forced complicity added another layer of psychological trauma that would haunt survivors for decades. The Oyat event was intended as a model of psychological warfare that would eliminate future resistance. News of the atrocity spread faster than the Mongol armies themselves through trade networks, diplomatic channels, and refugee populations fleeing the violence. Tribal leaders across the steppes found themselves weighing surrender against the fate that had befallen the Oyat. The calculation was simple and terrifying. Resist the Mongols and watch your daughters disappear into their system of sexual slavery, or submit immediately and hope for better treatment. That spectacle became shorthand across the steppes. Refuse the Mongols, and the same fate could follow. But the true scope of this systematic violence wouldn't become clear until centuries later, when modern science revealed the genetic fingerprints left behind by this continental-scale trauma. Today, genetic science can map the full scope of that terror with unprecedented precision. What if I told you that millions of people alive today carry the DNA evidence of history's most systematic sexual violence? Walk through any major city in Asia or Eastern Europe, and you're surrounded by living proof of Genghis Khan's reproductive warfare. The faces you see on the street, the families eating dinner in restaurants, the children playing in parks, many of them carry genetic markers that trace directly back to the Mongol Empire's calculated breeding programs. A 2003 genetic study identified a widespread Y chromosome pattern consistent with a single prolific paternal ancestor across the Mongol expansion area. Researchers studying Y chromosome patterns across Asia made a discovery that shocked the scientific community. They found identical genetic markers in populations scattered across thousands of miles of territory, from Mongolia to the Middle East to Eastern Europe. These weren't random similarities that might occur naturally over time. These were precise genetic fingerprints that could only result from a single male ancestor who had an extraordinary number of offspring across an enormous geographic area. The staggering statistic that emerged from this research reads like something from science fiction. 16 million men alive today carry Genghis Khan's Y chromosome. Think about what that number really means. That's more people than the entire population of most modern countries, carrying the direct genetic legacy of one man's systematic sexual violence. These aren't distant relatives connected through multiple generations of intermarriage. These are direct paternal descendants whose family trees trace back through an unbroken line of male ancestors to the Khan himself. Genetics confirms massive paternal lineage shifts that line up with the timing and geography of Mongol conquests. DNA samples from populations across the former Mongol Empire show genetic disruption that corresponds exactly to when and where Mongol armies appeared. Native paternal lineages that had dominated regions for thousands of years suddenly disappear from the genetic record, replaced by Mongol markers that appear simultaneously across vast distances. The geographic spread of Mongol paternal lineages reveals the scope of this biological warfare campaign. From the Pacific coast of China to the gates of Vienna, researchers find the same Y chromosome signatures in populations that had no natural reason to share genetic markers. Korean families carry the same paternal DNA as Iranian households. Russian communities show genetic connections to Chinese populations they had never encountered. The Mongol reproductive strategy had literally rewritten the genetic history of half the world. Mixed Mongol communities gained privileged status in administration and education systems that reinforced their genetic advantages with social benefits. Children with Mongol fathers received preferential treatment in government positions, access to better education, and opportunities for advancement that were denied to purely native populations. This created incentive structures that encouraged further intermarriage with Mongol bloodlines while systematically excluding families without the proper genetic credentials.
Cultural adaptations emerged as conquered civilizations rewired themselves around the memory of Mongol sexual terror. New marriage practices developed that prioritized protecting women from capture during raids. Architectural changes included hidden rooms and escape tunnels designed specifically to hide daughters and wives from advancing armies. Protective rituals and religious ceremonies evolved to invoke supernatural protection against the kind of systematic sexual violence the Mongols had perfected. Communities across Asia and Europe developed elaborate social codes designed to prevent the trauma their ancestors had experienced. Traditional clothing styles changed to make women less visible or attractive to potential raiders. Settlement patterns shifted toward more defensible locations that offered protection for vulnerable populations. Even food preparation and storage methods adapted to support families hiding in remote locations for extended periods during military campaigns. Civilizations rewired themselves around trauma memories that passed from parents to children like inherited diseases. Folk tales and oral histories preserved detailed warnings about the consequences of resistance to foreign armies. Cultural practices that had existed for centuries disappeared, replaced by survival strategies based on avoiding the attention of conquering forces. Languages absorbed new vocabulary related to hiding, escaping, and protecting family members from systematic sexual violence. Those markers are living proof of the policy's reach. Children, communities, cultures altered by forced reproduction. The calculated reproduction policies created a lasting genetic fingerprint that modern scientists can read like a history book written in DNA. Every genetic analysis confirms what the historical records documented. This wasn't random violence or chaotic warfare.
This was systematic biological manipulation designed to erase native bloodlines and replace them with Mongol genetic heritage. But if the system could change populations across continents, it also carried a structural vulnerability, one that would be exploited in the Khan's final days. The ultimate test of that vulnerability came from within the system itself.
Every system of absolute power has one fatal flaw. It assumes the victims will never fight back. For 21 years, Genghis Khan's machinery of sexual terror had operated with mechanical precision across half the known world. Millions of women had been processed through his scoring system, cataloged like inventory, and distributed according to bureaucratic protocols that treated human beings like livestock. The Khan himself had grown old and comfortable, surrounded by the fruits of his systematic cruelty. He had no reason to suspect that his own victims might be planning something beyond mere survival. Chroniclers and later storytellers record a version in which a Tangut princess named Gerbal kills the Khan. Historians debate the exact truth, but the version survives as powerful legend. Among the thousands of women in his personal collection was this Tangut princess, who had scored 98 on the Khan's selection scale. She possessed the kind of refined beauty that Mongol evaluators prized most highly: delicate features, unblemished skin, and the graceful bearing that came from royal upbringing. When Tangut resistance finally collapsed in 1227, she had been selected personally by the Khan as one of his most prized acquisitions. For 2 years, she had lived in the silk palaces, attended formal ceremonies, and played the role of compliant captive that kept her alive. But Gerbal had spent those 2 years doing more than just surviving. She had watched, listened, and planned with the patience of someone who understood that revenge was a dish best served when your enemy felt most secure.
She studied the Khan's routines, memorized the patterns of guards and servants, and identified the brief windows when absolute power relaxed its vigilance. Most importantly, she had slowly, carefully, methodically prepared the instrument of her revenge. The night that would change everything came during a storm in August 1227. Hidden in her elaborately braided hair was a blade no longer than her palm, crafted from a piece of metal she had carefully sharpened over months of patient work. It wasn't much of a weapon by warrior standards, but it was enough for what she needed to accomplish. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same elaborate hairstyle that had helped earn her high score on the Khan's beauty scale now concealed the instrument of his destruction. The strike came without warning or dramatic speeches. Gerbal simply positioned herself beside the sleeping Khan and drove the blade between his ribs with surgical precision. The Khan's eyes opened in surprise, then recognition, then something that might have been respect as he realized what was happening. He tried to speak, but blood filled his throat before words could emerge. The man who had built an empire on the systematic sexual exploitation of conquered women was dying at the hands of one of those very women. Gerbal watched the light fade from his eyes with the same clinical detachment that Mongol officials had shown while evaluating her physical attributes. The hunter had become the hunted in the most personal way imaginable. Her final act was as calculated as everything else she had done. Standing over the Khan's body, Gerbal spoke words that no one else heard, but that carried the weight of millions of voices. Then she walked calmly to the tent's entrance, stepped out into the storm, and disappeared into the raging river that bordered the camp. Her body was never recovered, but her message had been delivered. Whether or not the Gerbal account represents literal truth, the story undermined the aura of invulnerability and had real psychological impact within the empire. News of the Khan's death shattered Mongol confidence in their system of terror faster than their armies had conquered cities. The invincible leader who had seemed untouchable had been killed not by enemy warriors or rival commanders, but by one of his own victims. The machinery of systematic sexual violence suddenly seemed vulnerable in ways that traditional military threats never could have achieved. An empire that had terrorized continents suddenly realized that even absolute power could be pierced from within. The women they had treated as inventory were still human beings, capable of planning, patience, and devastating revenge when the opportunity finally presented itself. The empire endured, but the system, built on sexual terror, had been shown to be vulnerable. A single act of resistance had exposed the fundamental weakness in any system built on systematic cruelty. The death of the Khan marked the end of one man's reign, but the system he created had already left permanent scars. One woman's kidnapping triggered a policy of sexual domination that reshaped continents. That policy left both genetic and cultural wounds still visible today. 16 million descendants carried DNA evidence of systematic reproductive warfare, while entire civilizations developed survival strategies around the memory of Mongol sexual terror. Parts of this story are drawn from medieval chronicles and later legend. Where the record is contested, we've flagged that uncertainty. But the broader pattern remains clear in both historical documents and genetic research. What do you think? Can state violence ever be traced back to one personal wound? Tell us in the comments. The most dangerous lesson here isn't about medieval history.
It's about how private trauma, when wielded by those with absolute power, can be weaponized into policies that destroy millions of lives across generations.